Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Daniel Benitez, and I will be the moderator of this very interesting seminar or webinar on identifying and mitigating managing traffic risk in toll road PPP projects. Actually, when we were discussing with the speakers before coming to this presentation, we discussed that this is actually more than talking about traffic forecast. This is about the identification for sure, but it's about how we can mitigate and how we can manage the traffic risk during the project. And there is a key variable that we need to think of when we start talking about road planning. Probably it's traffic. It's probably the key variable that we start defining the size of the road, how we are going to connect people. And actually, if there is toll associated to this traffic, it's the opportunity for government, which are fiscally constrained, to use these funds basically to build new roads, to rehabilitate existing roads, and to guarantee that the roads will be maintained in a sustainable way. But it's also very important when it comes to the financing, because at the end, when you think on private investor, the proceeds of these toll revenues will be used to serve the debt. And it's even more complex when we talk about greenfield project, when we don't know exactly the track record of what the traffic could be. An investor always will be looking at the credit of these PPPs, at the bankability of the project, and the quality of the estimation of this traffic forecast when they decide to invest. This traffic is difficult, we know, and we have probably the best speaker to talk about this traffic forecast today, but we know that experience showed that in some of these projects, sometimes we basically miss the traffic that has been expected, at least at the forecast time, when in the actual traffic. And we know in many countries we have a renegotiation. Latin America is one of the examples, but in others we have bankruptcy. So it's very, very important to look at how we can basically estimate this traffic, but also how we can mitigate the risk, offer some credit enhancement to the investor in order to limit the impact of having traffic, which is probably not at the level of respect. We have here three speakers. I will ask them to introduce themselves after I finish. But we have Matt, Bull, Anita, and Lauren that will be talking about this very interesting topic of identifying, mitigating, and managing traffic risk. They will have 30-minute presentation followed by question and answer. So I will ask all the participants, if you have questions, please type in the chat window, and we'll try to respond and have a debate after this presentation. So over to you. I think Matt, you will comment, and you can say probably that the people can download this recording the website of GIF and PPPs, right?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll just introduce myself and my two colleagues as well. So my name is Matt Bull. I'm a senior infrastructure finance specialist with the Global Infrastructure Facility, based here at the World Bank in Washington, DC. I spent my early part of my career as a traffic forecaster before moving more into project finance and financial advisory work, where I still work today, but very much specialised in transport projects. I'm one of the lead authors of this publication that this webinar is based around, and I'll let Anita and Lauren introduce themselves too.
Hi, Lisa Locken. I'm a director at Stu Davis Gleave. I've spent the last 25 years forecasting traffic and revenue for a wide variety of transport infrastructure projects, but predominantly toll roads.
Okay, and I'm Lauren Wilson. I'm an analyst with the Global Infrastructure Facility here at the World Bank.
Okay, great. So the presentation. So what we're gonna do is take you through a quick presentation, which hopefully you'll all be able to see on your screens. Now, very much this presentation is based around, of course, a much bigger piece of work, which I'm holding up and plugging to the web, which is there's a link in the presentation to the big publication. It's a pretty in-depth piece of work, and obviously we can't cover it all in this 1 hour slot. But what we want to do is try and get across the key points and just how we're going to do this, how we're going to structure this presentation. We're going to talk about the crux of the issue, which is around forecasting, and the risk of those forecasts being inaccurate. Dive a little bit more into what's underneath that risk. Then importantly, how it can be reduced through the actions of both the forecaster and policymakers. And then finally, accepting that traffic risk is always going to be there. You can't be perfectly accurate in traffic forecasting, like in any forecasting. How do you manage what's residually still there? What the risk that remains? Which project party takes that risk? How can it be managed? So that's the basis of the presentation. So just some context of where we started on this. You know, we work here at the World Bank. We have a wide view of what's going on in the infrastructure finance market. The main impetus for starting this big piece of work was really the context of what was going on with a large number of high-profile toll road PPPs or concessions, and that is both in the developed world and also in the developing world, where there was a whole series of, as Danielle mentioned, bankruptcies, renegotiations, government bailouts, mostly resulting from the underperformance of the roads, the traffic being below anticipated forecast, and then the resulting financial distress of those projects. So that was really the context. But what we wanted to do, what we see with that whole story around these projects is some myths that come up, and misunderstanding around traffic risk and traffic forecasting and what's the best way to manage it. So we wanted to go right the way back to basics and write a piece of work that explains to people beyond the quite technical world of forecasting, what is underneath a traffic forecast. How does this risk of being inaccurate again? How can you deal with it? And you know, forecasting is very much a part of life. We use it in all fields. And what we wanted to be clear is that, you know, even though there is this history of inaccuracy and problems in the forecast, that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't do them. You just need to do them better. And so, you know, traffic forecasts are absolutely vital, not only for predicting the future cash flows and raising money against them, but they're also vitally important to plan our infrastructure, design it, dimension it, make sure that it's fit for purpose, not just tomorrow, but several years in the future. So forecasting is just an essential part of transport planning, basically. And it so happens that it's also used for this purpose of also raising finance, both public and private, in the context of PPP projects. But there is this history of particularly recent history of underperforming toll roads, and because it was very topical, we wanted to get underneath why this happens and how we can avoid it from happening, because it's costly for all parties. So what we want to just define here very quickly is what we mean by traffic risk. I mean, there could be different definitions, but really what we're saying is where the demand and revenue for a project is overestimated. As simple as that. And that, of course, results in all kinds of financial distress. And this is, of course, an issue for toll road projects. Now, there is empirical work on this issue. To the right of this slide, you can see only one of 14 US toll roads studied by JP Morgan exceeded the original revenue forecast. And on average traffic was 60% of the forecast. And Standard & Poor's, with a fairly seminal piece of work in 2005, found actual traffic averaged 77% of forecast levels in a sample of 104 roads. So two things to note here. One is the inaccuracy of the forecast, which as we'll go on to, is largely inevitable. This is a very difficult task, predicting traffic flows 20, 30 years into the future. Doing it perfectly is very difficult. But perhaps the more worrying and systematic problem is that there is a trend, not for underestimation, but for overestimation. It is, if you look at the graph at the bottom of that slide, you can see that there is a clear skew towards overestimating traffic flows, and that partly causes all of the problems that I've just mentioned. So that's really what we define as traffic risk. And so I'll hand over to Anita to say, the key building block in this is all around how traffic is actually forecast, and then we'll get into in those forecasts where the inaccuracy can come from.
Yes. So what we've done here is we've put together a diagram showing how the different parts of traffic forecast fit together. Now, this is just one example. There can be lots of varieties, but we've tried to put it in quite a simple way that everybody will understand. Forecasts can be produced by various project parties, and people will have a different appetite for risk, those different project parties. And so it's not uncommon for different sets of forecasts to be produced for those different parties. Typically, you'd use a traffic model. What we've referred to in the guide is a travel demand model, just as a generic term. There's lots of different names for that. So that could just be a spreadsheet, or it can be used in specialist transport planning software. And what the base model does is it tries to replicate existing travel behaviour on a road network or any transport network, which in itself is a really difficult thing to do. And we do that typically by understanding the origin and destinations of existing traffic in the form of a trip matrix, representation of the existing road network, and a set of behavioural parameters such as values of time, willingness to pay, which will determine people's route choices around that network. I won't go into detail about all different stages, but basically we first look at the in-scope traffic, the traffic that could use a new facility, if it was, for example, toll-free. Traffic capture, we use that to explain how much traffic will be captured by the road when a toll is applied. And then that will actually give us the forecast of the future traffic revenue forecasts, which are influenced by variables such as economic growth, employment growth, population growth, fuel prices, etc. So where does this traffic come from? The way we've explained as a company for many years now is trying to show pictorially where the traffic risk comes from and how it is built up in a traffic forecast. I find this is a really easy way of explaining to grantors, sponsors, lenders, everybody, how the traffic forecast, when it may be just one line in a revenue model, it is built up. So the diagram to the right looks at the various different building blocks of a traffic forecast. In this guide, we've actually looked at traffic risk under 3 different categories. One of them is modelling error. That's the source of traffic risk. So that refers to our ability to actually model existing behaviour. Uncertainty is the second source of traffic risk. That's trying to forecast future demand, as Matt said, in 20 or 30 years' time. And then the third element is bias. And looking at the chart again, what we tried to do is show that risk increases as you go up the y-axis. So the existing traffic, as long as you've actually counted it, observed it, understand it well, should be lower risk. And the only thing that should really affect that is your modelling error, your ability to model that existing traffic well, and you will be dependent on good data to do that. The second level of the traffic risk there is reassigned traffic. So when you actually put in a new piece of infrastructure, the model will predict how much additional traffic will come to your road, or actually maybe a sign away from your road if you're applying a toll to an existing brownfield road. So again, it adds an increasing level of risk, but it's modelling error still. And as traffic forecasters, we have some control over that. But anything sort of further up the chart than that is uncertainty error. So we're trying to forecast traffic growth over a long period of time. I've mentioned the variables that affect that traffic growth, but there's huge uncertainty around all those variables. One of the main ones being GDP, as we've seen in the last 10, 15 years. After we've looked at traffic growth, there's potential for development traffic, which may be speculative, increasing error again, and then induced traffic. So the definition of that is trips that don't take place without the facility open, but are induced because the facility is now open, reducing the cost of travelling. So that uncertainty is what we refer to traffic growth, development growth, and induced traffic. However, throughout all of that, the third source of traffic risk, bias, can actually apply to all levels, increasingly more in the higher levels of those building blocks. And I'll pass over to Matt to explain those levels of bias in more detail.
Sure. So what Anita has just explained is effectively the technical sources of inaccuracy in traffic forecasting. And as I said, it's a very difficult job. If you're not a traffic forecaster, think of the challenge of trying to predict these effectively millions of individual transactions over a period of 30 years. You're likely to be constrained by technical error and your uncertainty of the future. But if you took a sample of fictionally 5,000 forecasts, what you should see is that if they were the only factors affecting the traffic forecast, then you would imagine that you should average out to zero in terms, or somewhere close to zero in terms of your inaccuracy, in the sense that you should be as much up as you are down across a big sample of roads. But what we saw from the earlier slide is that that's not quite the empirical evidence, and that empirical evidence suggests that there is some kind of systematic over-prediction of traffic. And it's really, okay, yes, some of it could be on an individual project basis related to error and uncertainty, but over the whole portfolio, something, I'm afraid, slightly more nefarious is happening in the forecasting process, and that's where we get into the slightly controversial issue of bias. And bias can take many forms. We've really looked at three main sources of bias. First one is optimism bias, and this often comes from early on in the project development cycle, which is where governments are planning their infrastructure, are often seeking governmental approval to move their projects forward, and there is a sort of systematic incentive to make their project look attractive, to make sure it has a high cost-benefit analysis. And what's one of the key ways of doing that is basically to show the need and to show a high demand for the road, to show that it's a really good public investment, even before a private investment. So what you found with this is you get a phenomenon that's often referred to as the survivor's curse, which is the projects where some bias has been introduced right at the beginning, where the government is planning the road and planning the project. They're the projects that survive. They're the projects that gain approval, and then but you've started forecasting the traffic higher than it should be, and you sort of get a base effect, which stays with the project all the way through its life. Now, there are ways in which you need to keep checking that, and Lauren will talk to that in a moment. But we should not underestimate the fact that this isn't just about the often, and I'll get to strategic misrepresentation below, it's not just about that. It is about what happens in the government planning process before projects even get to the market, and we shouldn't ignore that happens. So bias is not just a private sector thing; it is also a public sector thing. But on the private side, we know, and this is a difficult issue to tackle, that we do know that bidders sometimes strategically misrepresent or can misrepresent their forecast. Why do they do that? Because their incentives may be set in a way that they want to win the bid. And winning the bid could be, depending on how the bid parameter is calibrated, let's say it's a toll rate, you can in your financial model achieve a lower toll rate if you have higher traffic forecasts, because basically your revenues are going to be higher. That allows you to offer a lower toll, and that gives you the ability to offer a lower price effectively. And so the bidder wins. Now, you can rightly ask the question, well, the bidder wins, but then finds himself in much more distress further down the line, so what was the point? That's a good question. However, the way these projects are often structured is that there are a number of parties. And it could be that, money can be, you can make a speculative call on traffic, win the right to build the infrastructure, make plenty of money on building the infrastructure, and that money that you make on building the infrastructure is greater than the losses that you might suffer in the future. So you take all of the gain up front, and then make losses in the future, but those losses are more heavily discounted, and the bidder, often major contractors, for example, are able to still keep themselves whole and make money from the process. But then that's good for them, but then other parties are left suffering. So particularly third-party financiers, banks, or third-party equity, so not the contractor equity, for example. Or if they fall over, the financiers, and it's a big project as a result of this, then the government starts to suffer, because the government is the one that might need to bail the road out or step in to operate the road, etc. So this is really the really key thorny issue associated with bias. It happens. I won't name countries, I won't name projects, but we know that it happens, and it's something that we should all try to avoid across. Now, slightly less nefarious but important, and I think particularly important in the developing country context, is something called the winner's curse, and this is something that's common to most auctions or auction theory, whereby bidding for toll road projects is essentially like an auction, and the participants in that auction all have different levels of information access, and because you have different levels of information access, different parties can come to very different views on the traffic forecast, and what happens is you can get higher traffic forecasts because a party has just got less information than the others. And so they end up winning, but they're cursed because they knew less about the situation. And that's also something that can happen. So all three of these things often are interrelating with each other, and in some sense can be compounding each other. And that might be why we see this kind of systematic overestimation of traffic and the distress that's causing. So the next question is, well, what can we actually do about that? So
thanks, Matt. Yeah, so now we're going to turn to how it can be reduced. And the good news is that there are several different steps that forecasters and governments can take to reduce error, uncertainty, and bias, and reduce the overall level of traffic risk in their projects. So starting off with error, improving data collection, the traffic model, and the forecasting is key to reducing error in projects. So as Anita mentioned, this is somewhat under the control of forecasters. So improving the traffic model and improving the data, the inputs that are fed into that model, and getting a really good understanding of what the existing scenario is before the infrastructure is built can really help to reduce the error. And so this will include things like deeper data collection, and especially if tolls are being introduced, willingness to pay studies, and getting a very good understanding of how likely consumers are to pay to use a toll road. And in the book, we go into this in a bit more detail, and there's a full checklist that includes a long list of different types of error and specific ways to mitigate those. With uncertainty, it's really looking at the long-range forecasting variables and assumptions, and how realistic are those assumptions, and how much uncertainty is around each of those assumptions. So using multiple assumptions, benchmarking those assumptions from reliable sources, so maybe using IMF or World Bank data for GDP and that kind of thing, and also doing sensitivity tests around it. So what happens if some of the key assumptions increase or decrease, and how does that affect the traffic demand? With uncertainty, there's also part of that that the government has a bit more under its control, specifically the policy environment. And so introducing things like a tariff or a toll policy can help create a more stable policy environment and reduce the overall uncertainty for the project. And then finally, with bias, as Matt was saying, there are several different types. This is a very common issue that we see in projects. There's several different steps that governments can take here. So one is just improving the amount of data that's available, and that includes to the government itself. So doing traffic forecast and having that independently reviewed to help address some of those survivor curse and optimism bias that we talked about. And then making that base model available to bidders can help bidders all start off on a level playing field with data. So that also can help reduce the winner's curse and can provide a benchmark to help governments identify where bidders may be over-aggressive in their bidding or trying to do some of the strategic misrepresentation.
So there are some of the practical steps that we outline to reduce the risk, and there is a lot that can be done, particularly in countries that haven't had a track record of preparing these major projects, particularly with private sector participation. And that's a big part of obviously what we do with the World Bank and also the Global Infrastructure Facility is trying to get governments to do that high quality project preparation. You can't underestimate the importance of doing that. But even once you have made all of these steps, the good technical approach to forecasting, the policy, creating a policy environment, trying to dampen down the incentives for speculative behavior. Even once you've done all that, we still can't perfectly predict traffic 20 or 30 years into the future. It's just a very, very difficult task. And so the question then comes, well, how do you actually, who manages that risk? How is that risk structured into the project? Now, again, the context, one of the big reasons why we took this on is really the context of what you actually hear a lot of is, traffic risk is really large, is really something that private financiers in particular can't deal with. All that risk has to be carried now by the government because of this history of bankruptcies and everything else. But what we viewed that as is a far too simplistic view of the world, just because has been this track record. And what it is that no projects, and this is the same for many aspects of infrastructure and infrastructure finance, is that projects are just not homogeneous. They're very, very different in all cases. And really the decision of whether the private sector takes some of this risk or all of this risk is really about the risk and reward equation of every single project. So if risks are low and the amount of profit that can be made on the project are high, then frankly private sector players are going to be interested. That's just a fact. So it is possible in that situation that even in today's capital constrained markets and slightly risk averse markets, that a toll concession where the users pay and that's the sole revenue source of the concessionaire, that still could work. But it really is a question of how much, what the cash flows look like and what the risks are around those cash flows. So if the risks are low and the cash flows are high, then that could work. But what we find is that a lot of projects, of course, don't fall into that sort of bottom right-hand part of the box. And I think the two really important boxes on this diagram here on the right are on the top right, where okay, in the base case forecast, so your best estimate forecast, things look good. But when you run a whole series of sensitivity tests and look at how bad things could become, you actually find that if the risk materializes, the financial situation could look very bad. So in all being well, a user-paid toll road could work, but you need some kind of downside risk protection. So that might be minimum revenue guarantees, it could be some kind of revenue sharing arrangement, it could be first loss mechanisms. So that's obviously a big part of it. But there are, of course, then projects where there just isn't enough traffic, and this is often the case with developing country projects. There just isn't enough revenue in the base case that will enable you to amortize all of the investment costs as well as keep the road in decent shape. And so in that situation, and also you still, particularly on a greenfield road, you're still struggling to really predict what the traffic will be. So you've got this situation of high risk, high reward, high risk, low reward, and in that situation, really, the government has to take the risk. Now, in all of these cases, we're not answering the question here whether it's desirable or value for money to do a PPP in these situations. That's a whole separate question which we're not going to talk about here. What we're showing is what's possible based on the relative risk and the relative reward of a project, and it helps. The idea is here to give you a very an overview of what a transaction advisor in particular goes through in his thinking when structuring one of these projects, and just the mechanics of that. It's really like it's kind of like a two-step process. First, you've got to build a financial model. And you do this as a government first. This is the idea. It's often what's referred to as shadow bid model. So you start. What governments really need to do when dealing with this risk and structuring this risk is try to replicate what a bidder is going to go through when they start to look at their project. And what does a bidder do? They build a financial model of the project using the best case estimates that the traffic forecast is doing, which is often referred to as the central case. I need to talk more about that process. And you look at what that looks like using typical financial outputs, IRR, MPV, etc. Does it look good? Do you meet your cover ratios, which is basically a debt requirement? Is there enough spare cash in the project, etc.? And then what you do is you work with the traffic forecaster and say, look, run my worst case scenarios, also run my best case scenarios. And then what happens? Tell me what happens then. Tell me what the traffic and revenue will be then. And then I'll run that back through the financial model and I'll see what happens in that situation. And it's really then down the two little diagrams on the bottom right is really what you're looking at. So in your low case, your sort of worst case situation, if you find yourself with your cover ratios, for example, being below default level set by the bank, by your lender, then obviously you're in big trouble. You're not going to be able to secure the financing because under a potential bad situation, you start to, your credit starts to look very, very, very weak. And so it's at that point where you go back and say, well, look, this it's not a probable case, but it could happen. And if it does happen, I'm going to start defaulting on my loan. And that basically tells you that the risk might be too high and you need need to go back to that matrix and think, how can I actually, what might be a more equitable, fair way to share risk? So this is explained in a lot more detail in the in the book, and it's also how transaction advisors demand very high fees and pay lots of money. But we wanted to sort of debunk that whole process, and hopefully we've been able to do that. So we'll finish there. That's a quick run through of the risk, of where it comes from, how to reduce it, and then how to structure it effectively. It's all contained in that lovely book. That's on the link there onto the GIF and PF websites. And for that one, that's all.
Well, thank you to the speaker, actually on time, so that was perfectly calibrated. No risk on that. So there are many questions. I will summarize that, but I would like to start with one, which is, I mean, you showed that the JP Morgan and Standard & Poor's, and all of them show that basically the estimation has been quite below actual traffic, quite above actual traffic. So Anita, when you receive one of these studies and then you need to review study for one of your clients or for one of the government that you're advising, how that information, knowing that in general we miss the actual traffic. So how you recommend to look at if I am a bank and you come with your different scenarios, your worst scenario probably for the bank would be my best scenario, right? So how does it work in practice?
Well, I think one of the key things is allowing you to understand the basis of the traffic forecast in the first place. If you're given a very short report with no information in it, how are you going to understand the forecast? How are you going to understand how the forecast has been built up? What assumptions are in the forecast? It should be clearly marked out, the assumptions that got into that forecast for you. In terms of due diligence of that traffic study, you'd be looking at key areas of that traffic report. You'd be looking at how the base model was built, how well it validated, how well it represented existing behaviour, how well the new infrastructure was interpreted into the model, the credibility of the traffic growth forecasts that were put in, the credibility of all the forecasting assumptions clearly laid out so you could understand them, not in a very technical. Sometimes our reports can be too technical as traffic forecasters, but they should really be quite simple. And then, importantly, at the end, you should have a list of sensitivity tests, sensible ones, that you understand actually if the willingness to pay is lower, if the complementary scheme that the government's promised will be delivered on time is not delivered on time, what will be the impacts on your road? There's areas like that are under the control of the traffic forecaster, but there's lots of areas that aren't under the control. We've listed those in the guidance, but multiple ones in terms of GDP, for example. Obviously, the traffic forecaster can't be responsible for that. Change of government, which happens quite often. Change of policy in terms of alternative roads. Somebody comes and builds a competing road. So what we're trying to do is sort of give a list, and I'm sure there'll be the new problems arise in future of toll roads that we haven't listed there, but give a list of areas in terms of the whole deal that lenders or grantors or traffic forecasters can look at to sort of mark off, check their project is affected by them.
I think this is a really important aspect, and it comes from our experience, working sometimes here at the bank and in other lines of work, is that we often see, particularly in developing countries, is that the audit trail on the traffic work is not as strong as it should be, and that in itself can cause a lot of trouble because you're unable to really appraise the risk in a meaningful way, and that's it's a bit like the optimism bias situation. It can then cascade all the way through the project because the quality of information is not available all the way downstream then, and sort of everyone then starts building their own forecast, and then you end up with very different sets of forecasts, etc. So this is why one of the really key messages out of this is that governments, even before you get into thinking about PPPs and all of that fancy stuff, is that you really have to think about this from a planning perspective. Is my road needed? What kind of road is needed? How's the forecast affected the design? And then put that down on paper so that the decisions that you make have a clear audit trail. And then when bidders do come to pick it up, they can see that audit trail and can all start from a similar platform. But this often doesn't happen. And so a big thing, obviously, that we do with our project preparation facility, the GIF, is to try and give governments the support to do this preparatory work first before they get into engaging with the private sector.
There are many questions on the risk mitigation. No? And because traffic is difficult to estimate, and sometimes investor or sponsor doesn't want to take that risk. Can we say that we are setting a trend to develop more projects on availability payment type of?
We haven't done the data, but it's one thing that we said we would do is to just show that trend. The trend is a result of this distress in the various projects that we talked about. There is definitely now more availability payment structures, and that I guess makes sense in some cases, but in other cases it might not. There is this now large risk aversion around traffic risk, which should not be uniformly decided. That's one of the key messages. Each project needs its own set of high-quality traffic forecasts and its high-quality risk analysis around each forecast. Because it might be, if you've got a fiscally constrained government, that they want this off-balance sheet, that they want the users to pay, that they want the private sector to take some of this risk so that they're less exposed. I mean, that is what a lot of governments want to do. So you shouldn't just default to a certain structure. In reality, it's often the right decision, I think, but not always, right? So the traffic, even in an availability payment, if it's a toll road, but it's the private sector is being paid by an availability payment, the traffic risk doesn't go away. It's now just being absorbed by the public sector. So the public sector is now fiscally exposed to that lower than anticipated forecast. So it still means that you have to be fully on top of that risk and to be appraising it in exactly the same way as we spoke about here. So I think availability payments are a little bit seen as, my sense is that it's sometimes seen as a panacea, but it creates payment risk as well. You know, if you've got a sub-investment grade country who's on the hook to pay you a very large payment in the millions and millions of dollars every quarter, I'm not sure I would be that comfortable as an investor with it, right? So you know, yes, availability payments, but traffic risk doesn't go away, and the payment risk certainly is there. So you need to think about, you kind of switch from traffic risk to payment risk. How are you going to mitigate that payment risk? And that's where you need to think about payment guarantees, for example, etc. So it is. It's certainly not the solution to all the problems, but it certainly is a trend. There's no doubt about that.
Well, one of the participants was mentioning the case of India, when there are, I mean, many of the questions go beyond the traffic risk, which are political risk or land acquisition. No? But one of the participants was mentioning the case of India, where many roads, low traffic roads, has been tolled. So, and then we know the story because traffic was not sufficient to repay the debt. So, will you recommend to use a kind of mechanism where you have a mix of availability payment for the capex and some toll risk for the operational maintenance? Or we can track all the risks to the public sector availability payment, but we can still keep some risks on the private side.
And I think India did that actually in response to the problems that the audience member raised. So they did do some, I think, I always forget the names that they use, but I think they called it. Well, I don't know. Basically, that approach where you put some capital subsidy into the project that buys down some of the investment costs to a level where the traffic revenues can allow you to repay that smaller amount of private capital. So you're reducing the amount of private investment required to a level where the traffic revenues can support it. Now that helps on the reward side of it, so it helps making the project sufficiently profitable for the private sector to be interested, but it might not help on the risk. So you still might have significant variability on the traffic forecast, even though the project in the base case looks profitable. So that's only solving the fact that there's not enough traffic on what is probably an expensive road, right? So the fact is that roads are always pretty capital intensive and relatively low traffic in the early years of their life. This is sort of the main problem, that you basically have in toll roads in particular. All your value is in the back end. It's very capital intensive to build, and your revenues are lowest at the point where your debt obligations are at the highest, and that's what creates a lot of this financial constraint. So the model that you talked about is a way of easing that constraint, that financial constraint. But then what happens if your low case knocks down 30% of the traffic? Then you're bankrupt. So you haven't solved that problem. So it depends what your problem is, whether that solution works. If it's just not enough traffic, maybe. But if it's not enough traffic and a high risk around whatever traffic you're forecasting, then you've got a bigger problem than just giving some capital. So that's that.
Just added to that, something else is that if the traffic isn't there in the first year or two of the operation, after the ramp up has just moved on, then the traffic probably isn't going to come. So we've found that looking at sort of past experience that actually it's trying to model the first few years of operations, which is the most difficult thing. The secondary element is modelling traffic growth after that. But really, if the project is going wrong, you can see it quite quickly.
For the first couple of years. There is a more fundamental question from one of the participants, which is probably we covered that in different way, but it's when roads should be tolled. So I mean that covers different angle of discussion. It's go even on the political economy side too. But in your experience, what kind of recommendation you can give, or how you will approach that issue when your government asks you, should we toll it or should we basically use a banana?
Well, I mean, it depends on whether the government needs that toll revenue. It's the principle of user pay we use for other utilities in life. We've got used to not paying directly for roads in many countries. So developing countries and developed countries see it as a way of drivers contributing to the cost of the road. And if that toll is not set too high, people recognise the benefits of that road, that upgraded road or a brand new road, in general, they are willing to pay that toll. But there are cases when it's completely inappropriate, when we're saying when the traffic is very, very low, when you're trying to toll a road which has lots and lots of local traffic. Urban toll roads are more difficult. If you have a history of tolling already in the country, it makes it a lot easier to add another toll road to your network. It makes it quite difficult when you have no tolls. So there's many different questions you've really got to ask, and certainly just don't jump into thinking it's a golden solution to building new roads, is to actually put together a toll road network, because it isn't easy at all. It's quite difficult, and you've got to try and bring the public on board as well and explain why it needs to be tolled, and then show the benefits really of that toll network. And together we did a project in Mozambique which hadn't faced tolling before. We ran some fantastic focus groups where people were explained why it needed to be tolled, they were explained the new road would be built with the toll, and it was in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. It's been a very successful toll road. So it can be done, I think, if you go into it sensibly and with consultation, public consultation.
And I think just to add to that, there's also, if you want to get into the sort of economics of it, I think if there's a clear situation where a certain group of, particularly a group of users, are exposing a large marginal cost, so their journeys impose a big cost on the road, so particularly around pavement damage and the maintenance requirement, but they're not compensating you in any way for that damage, then that's quite disproportionate. So this is where often, so in developing country context, what we often see is particularly transit countries, where actually, and this is just to give you an example of this point, is that trucks, very heavy and often overloaded trucks, are using the road. They're not paying any vehicle tax or any road tax in the country, but they're imposing huge pavement damage on the road, which then becomes the government's burden. And so the taxpayers of the country pay, but the foreign trucker pays nothing. And so in a way, it's kind of like maybe a bit of rent seeking or whatever. But there are very specific circumstances, depends on the road, that you think this is a corridor where I need to balance this out a little bit. And the flip side is exactly what Anita said. You can't really do that in the same way where there's not the ability to pay or the willingness to pay. So local users, frequent users, and again, from an economics perspective, there's an income constraint, a budget constraint. You just can't keep pushing on. So this is a multi-dimensional issue, but absolutely crucial. What we've done, and Anita's helped us on this in a couple of countries, and there is some stuff on PIAP website on this, is around fundamentals of toll policies and tolling strategies, which is another piece of work that we did, and we can refer people to. Slightly different issue, but it's a fundamental planning issue.
This issue of tracking is quite relevant in Europe. Also, people all this country are complaining when trucks are crossing the country. But coming to this tolls discussion, I remember a study in Brazil on user perception. After Brazil in the 90s privatized the road, improved the quality of the road, and people were really willing to pay. And they basically, after 5 years of the improvement in the road, people were still keeping high expectation, basically, it's coming that we're receiving the benefit from the road. And after year 5, they start complaining. So why would we need to pay for a road that has been constructed? There was no change in the quality of the road. There was no change in the pattern of traffic. So the level of congestion was improved, so on. But there's a kind of fatigue for people trying. So this is a very complex issue to cover. I have a question. Was mentioned by Lauren on this issue of the bidder strategy. So they may have tempted to bid above that and to penalize aggressive forecasting in bid evaluation. How does this work in practice? Because this is the same problem. We always look at, when this is an availability type of project, they ask for less money and then we'll try to renegotiate, they will try to change the level of investment and so on. How you can penalize?
It's difficult. That we mentioned in the study that this isn't a simple thing to calibrate or to even do, and not everyone, I think, logged into this webinar or people who work in this area would agree with this recommendation because it's so difficult to calibrate. But you've got to think of the counterfactual in some situations. Again, it depends on the road. But if it is an urban toll road where there's lots of route choice, it's very difficult to forecast. There is the potential for very different outcomes across different and you just need you might need some kind of benchmark that basically says their bid is not realistic because it's 80% or 100% above my reference case. And you will have that reference case because of what we've said, is that you need to do a government side, high quality traffic study before you go and interact with the private sector. So what do you do? So I flip it round, let's say, because I've been in this situation on the government side. What do you do? So you've got someone saying, oh, I think traffic's going to be double. Or when I haven't put anything in my evaluation criteria which says, oh, okay, that's fine. And so you're then saying, okay, in 3 years' time, I'm going to be renegotiating with you on that. So what do you do in that situation? So if you think that's going to be a problem, you need to do something. And so typically what you would do is set some, exactly how you do it, we could talk about, but you basically say if there is a diversion on the forecast of so much, then you get marked down on this criteria by this much, and that gets thrown into, or you have an overall threshold where you say, look, you don't change the evaluation at all, but if it reaches a certain level, you just think this road is this much down. And you just say, but you go back through the bidding process and say, look, we need to go back and revise this, and we're worried about that dialogue. Very difficult, but think about if you don't do it. So of all the bits in here, I think this is the more open part of it. That solutions, you need to think through solutions. And this is less binding because there's been such a move towards availability payments, availability payment models. But does that mean, we might just not have set the incentive right in the bidding process for toll road projects, and that's what this is trying. That's what we're trying to recommend. If you set those incentives right, and some of this is also, you might not get this situation if you do a high quality traffic study, if you provide the base model or the outlines of the model to the bidders, etc., etc. You might not end up in that situation anyway, because everyone's starting from a high quality, good quality base. So yeah, but sometimes it's a fact that the way PPP's bidding finance is structured, you might get this speculative behavior. So what are you going to do about it? You're just going to accept it and then renegotiate it 3 or 4 years' time. Renegotiations are very costly.
Yeah, and I think the thing to say, it's not always the highest focus that wins in our experience as well. It is sometimes the best forecast, the most accurate. So, but it is a very difficult, because you think you're pushing the risk onto the private sector and you want them to take that risk, but ultimately in the long term, the road will come back to you. And it may damage actually future toll road plans in the whole of the country. We've seen that in some Eastern European countries just because of one initial failure at the beginning.
There is only 1 minute remaining, so in one of the recommendations is that the government should provide a reference case forecast. This is a recommendation. That kind of play in both directions. Could be the government has a bias, thinking that traffic will be high, but also the government basically may show that limit to what is strategic behavior.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear on that, they might not provide the reference case forecast.
Oh.
I mean, that's another open question. Depends how much you want to create. If you provide it, you are going to reduce you're not going to be able to expose the different appetites and traffic risk around the different bidders. So that's a decision to be made. What the reference case it basically is that the government has an idea from its point of view of what the traffic is going to be, and that enables them to come with their own valuation of the project and compare that against what the bidders are saying. So that is that's the idea of a reference case, is that you can compare yourself. Whether you provide it to the bidders or not is a separate question. If you provide it to the bidders, what's going to happen? You're going to get very similar forecasts around it than if you don't. If you don't, you'll get a wider range of appetite around the traffic risk. But what we did say is, if you've done that benchmarking forecast, provide the bones of that forecast to the bidders. So provide the outline of the model. So bidders can save time and money on the whole process of building a traffic model, which is a complex task. And not only does it save time and money, it means everyone starts from the same place pretty much, which should stop this winner's curse situation. where someone who's got a lot less information and doesn't know what they're doing ends up winning. So that's really the recommendation around that. Whether you supply it or not, the actual forecast, often I would say no if you try to get people to take it. Trying to get the private sector to express their appetite for this. So probably can be done.
Well, I think that we reached the end of this webinar, and I would like to thank to the speaker and author of this very interesting report. I was reading the question from the participant, and they say that one of them say that the report will help to enhance my knowledge about the traffic risk. So I recommend you to all of interested in download and even contact the expert on the topic. I think we can spend hours discussing about tolls and risk in the project. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you.